Hello, English students. This is a screencast on characterization. This is for your narrative at this moment, but it is related to the story Two Gallants from Dubliners. Your narrative is based somewhat on Dubliners, especially mimicking to a certain degree the thematic elements in those stories, where each one had some paralysis and some epiphany that stemmed from each story's differing versions of expectation versus reality. Now, you have to develop characters. Characterization is one of the more important aspects of narrative writing. If your characters aren't important to the reader, your story is unlikely to be. So, I'm going to review this story a little bit, being probably my favorite in the collection, and also maybe one of the more memorable. It is also the one we did the characterization task on in class, so I thought it would be a good way to jump in there because you've already explored these characters quite a bit. And so, thinking about how James Joyce, the writer, characterizes Corley and Lenehan and shows us their relationship, power structures, and how those interactions make sense of each character in the text, it will help you hopefully form your own characters that are rich, complex, and nuanced. So, we can define characterization as it refers to the way authors convey, transmit, show the personalities, and express the meaning behind characters. And it is not that dissimilar from the way we judge characters in our own lives. The same way that a narrator or a writer uses a narrator to set up a character is very, in the way we as readers understand that character, it's very similar to the way we as humans understand character in other humans. So, however, focusing more on literary characterization, there are two categories, broad categories, and they are direct and indirect. So, let's define them. Direct characterization comes from the narrator and is spoken to the reader directly. An example of direct characterization might be if the narrator said, she was an old woman with a short temper. It's very telling, obviously, but it's also very direct. Our speaker is telling us what we are supposed to know as readers about his or her character, this old woman. Indirect characterization, there's a lot more categories we're going to concern ourselves with, or I guess we could call them subcategories. Subcategory 1 for indirect characterization is through what other characters say about this character. This would be dialogue, which is why I've parenthesized dialogue at the end there. New example, Don is always stealing from his friend, said Jane. Here we have a characterization of Don because of what was said about him by Jane. Now, if we trust Jane as readers, then we trust that Don is always stealing. Now, you can complicate things. If maybe we don't trust Jane as a reader, and maybe we know that she's lying about Don, but that would have to do with setting up your characters very carefully to make that happen. But this is indirect in that we have Jane saying something about Don, and like I just showed you, we kind of have to negotiate it because we're not 100% sure because it's not being directly told to us by a narrator we might trust. So you can also indirectly characterize by analyzing what characters say about themselves if you want to analyze characterization. But obviously, if you're writing rich characters, you want to make sure that what your characters say are representative of what you want to say about them. Example, I've got a nice place here. This is a quote I've talked about in the past. It's from The Great Gatsby. One of the more antagonistic characters, Tom Buchanan, who is hubristic and arrogant. This is the first piece of dialogue he speaks in the text. When the narrator, Nick Carraway, goes to see him again after many years, the first thing he does is try to show off the ostentatious nature of his house. If and I've mentioned this in the past, and this may be me personally, but if I were to show up to a friend's house I hadn't seen in a very long time, and the first thing he did was brag about his new place in a very arrogant way, I would turn around and leave. So, again, you can characterize people by what they say, obviously. So a character saying these types of things themselves, that helps us figure out the type of person they are. And finally, through action, if not commented on. So when a speaker describes action, if the narrator then tells you what to think of that character's action, well, that would be direct. But if they give us action that we now need to infer, that is indirect. So an example, and this is a pretty harsh one, and I love puppies, I don't mean this, but you can see how I don't really need to be directly told that this is a bad person. He tossed the puppy off the pier with a smirk is pretty clearly the action of someone who's terrible. So that person has been characterized without having to be directly told. So the ones on this page are what we would call more the showing versus the telling. Okay, there's a pause on that. Sorry. Okay, so here is the exposition, the first part of 2 gallons. 2 young men came down the hill of Rutland Square. One of them was just bringing a long monologue to a close. The other, who walked on the verge of the path and was at times obliged to step onto the road owing to his companion's rudeness, wore an amused, listening face. He was squat and ruddy. A yachting cap was shoved far back from his forehead, and the narrative to which he listened made constant waves of expression break forth over his face from the corners of his nose and eyes and mouth. Little jets of wheezing laughter followed one another out of his convulsed body. His eyes, twinkling with cunning enjoyment, glanced at every moment towards his companion's face. Once or twice he rearranged the light waterproof which he had slung over one shoulder in toreador fashion. His breeches, his white rubber shoes, and his jauntily slung waterproof expressed youth. But his figure fell into rotundity at the waist. His hair was scant and gray, and his face, when the waves of expression had passed over it, had a ravaged look. So my question to the left is the clues that point to the relations between these 2 men. Because as we know from when we worked on our characterization for this story, I actually had you compare them as foils into a Venn diagram to point that out. So another way you can make characterization happen is by presenting 2 characters the reader is supposed to compare. That's not required of your story, but this is one of the ways Joyce is doing it in here. And that would be indirect characterization if you were doing it as a foil comparison, as long as you as a writer, as a narrator of your story, don't tell the reader outright what they're supposed to think. And you shouldn't in this case. If you're doing a comparison of characters as a foil, don't tell your reader what to think. Show us and we will figure out what to think. That's enlivening writing. That's good narrative writing. So let's start looking at these clues bit by bit. We have a character with a long monologue. Now, these characters have no names yet. So if we were first encountering the story, we would have no idea that that is Corley. We've read it, we've studied it, so we know it's Corley. Corley is giving a long monologue. It's not just a monologue being the opposite of dialogue. So we know he's talking basically to himself aloud next to Lenehan. And it's a long monologue. He's finally bringing it to a close. So we know that he's been talking uninterruptedly for a very long time when the story begins. Now, the other, who walked on the verge of the path and was at times obliged to step onto the road owing to his companion's rudeness, or an amused listening face. So now we have the other character. One character is giving a long monologue. The other character is being forced off of the sidewalk by the person delivering a monologue. He's obliged to, which almost means as if he feels ordered to and is fine in doing so. Our speaker directly calls Corley's behavior rudeness, so we know that Corley is a rude person, he's acting rudely, but we also get that Lenehan not only doesn't seem to mind, but seems to be eager to maintain this particular relationship, and it continues that way. Not going to do that again, my apologies. Next, he was squat and ruddy. So I just wanted to get this. This is the same passage, just continuing on. And this is still describing Lenehan. So we have some direct characterization. He was squat and ruddy, which translates into short and red of face, or red-faced. He's also wearing a yachting cap. So his yachting cap, was shoved far back from his forehead. So he has it's back on his forehead, so you would imagine that the front of his hair is showing. And the narrative to which he listened made constant waves of expression break forth over his face from the corners of his nose and eyes and mouth. Little jets of wheezing laughter followed one another out of his convulsed body. Convulsing laughter, wheezing laughter, jets of laughter, breaking forth. All of these words that are chosen by our author are showing us that Lenehan is laughing astoundingly at this. It's a large it's a big action, this laughter. He's taking a lot of pride almost in his laughing. He's doing it in a way that is showy. You can almost sense that he wants Corley to, without a doubt, know that he is really enjoying this story. Really enjoying. So, he's walking. Once or twice he rearranged the light waterproof, or waterproof jacket is what that means. So he had a waterproof jacket, he had a jacket, a raincoat, and he had slung over his shoulder in toreador fashion, much like a bullfighter, which is what a toreador is. So you can imagine that's probably a little showy and ostentatious, but Lenehan's coat would have been slung over his shoulder in a similar way. And although this toreador is not wearing a yachting cap, it's a similar cap. So you can imagine that Lenehan is trying to present himself in a way that may seem dashing and in charge. Now, we continue because he does fall into rotundity at his waist. His hair was scant and gray, and his face had a ravaged look when he wasn't laughing. So we have direct characterization here that is telling us that Lenehan, while appearing young, when that moment of artificiality passes, he may look like he actually feels inside. He looks old and gray and ravaged. And so we have these characters that are very complicated. And in this one paragraph, we not only get the relationships between the two, but we get a lot about Lenehan, and we start to see that he seems to be pretending, almost over exaggerating his affection for Corley. He seems to be trying to convey a version of himself that is younger than he actually feels and appears once he stops the artificiality of his laughter. And so we understand that those characteristics of these two, they carry forth throughout the rest of the story. So this exposition does a precisely positive and good job of presenting the characters as an exposition is supposed to. So continuing on in the story, this is what Lenehan says after Corley finishes his story. He says to Lenehan, well, that takes the biscuit. His voice seemed winnowed of vigor. It seemed like the vigor or the energy was suddenly gone from his voice. It seems as if that old aspect of himself suddenly took over, and so to try and conceal it, it says, and to enforce his words, he added with humor, that takes the solitary, unique, and if I may so call it, a Reshirk biscuit. Okay, so is this direct or indirect? Well, we should know by now that this is indirect characterization. We're trying to sort something out about Lenehan's character based on the way he talks. So he says something about taking the biscuit, right? And here's a biscuit. In case we're wondering what they're probably referring to, and I'll get to that question in a minute. Sorry, there it is. There's the biscuit. So what it says about his character for me is he says first, that takes the biscuit. Now that is supposed to be a congratulatory remark for Corley's story. It's probably in a vernacular we no longer speak in. It was a slang of the day, but it would be like, well, that takes the cake, might be what we say now. Oh, what a great story. That's the best story I've ever heard. But when he says it, he realizes his voice probably doesn't sound energetic enough and tries to re-energize his voice with humor by adding extra verbiage to what kind of biscuit it is. So we can see that he is trying his very best to show a youthful energy and to show that specific energy at this moment to Corley. And we know why as we continued the story, because he wanted to get in on the money that Corley was planning to steal from the maid. So I wanted to add another quote about Lenehan to talk about what it reveals about him. He spoke roughly in order to belie his air of gentility, for his entry had been followed by a pause of talk. So if you recall, at one point, Corley goes off on his date, and Lenehan wanders the streets of Dublin alone and winds up in this little cafe, where he orders his meal of peas and ginger beer, and it's on a white plate. And so Joyce gives us the colors of the Irish flag as Lenehan sits and ponders his future and his life. But this is right when he's walking in. And so he walks in and he has an air of gentility. If you don't know what that means, it means he has sort of an upper class edge to him. And so when he walks into this cafe, everybody stops talking because he seems out of place. So his face gets heated, meaning he becomes suddenly embarrassed. His ruddy face becomes ruddier. And so to appear natural, he pushed his cap back on his head even more. Remember, it was already back on his head. And he planted his elbows on the table. So we see again him trying to affect a personality to match the mood of others. He tries to become what others want of him. Now he's called in the story a leech, so we can start to see that the direct characterization of Leech is also being reinforced by this direct characterization, which also requires some inference of you as a reader. But we should know that if he walks in and suddenly people stop talking because of his air of gentility and he tries to pretend that he's less genteel, right? We know what he's doing as a character. We know something about him. So this is what he thinks about. And so we get him now. We know that he is eager to please, and we know that he doesn't seem to have a lot of personality. He seems to be the leech, right? The person who does what others want him to do or becomes what others want him to become to get something out of them. But he thinks to himself, right? He would be 31 in November. Would he never get a good job? Would he never have a home of his own? And keep in mind, he's gray at 31. That's not normal. It happened to me. It was amazing. I'm almost completely gray at 42. 43 on Friday, but that's me. I guess I'm like Lenehan. That's okay. He would be 31 in November. Would he never get a good job? Would he never have a home of his own? He thought how pleasant it would be to have a warm fire to sit by and a good dinner to sit down to. He had walked the streets long enough with friends and with girls, right? He just walked the street with Corley. We see that he's kind of trying to turn the path here, trying to change his life. He's having his epiphany that he should change it. Now, the paralysis is that he really doesn't, right? At the end of the story, he still ends up with Corley. He still takes the coin. He still does what he probably shouldn't have done because he's not advancing his life into what he's dreaming of right now. He was, again, sort of what we would call, what's the word I'm looking for? He was just shoved back into the cycle of his normal life. And all of this reflection that he had in this cafe comes to naught. His epiphany is paralyzed by Dublin at the end. But he thought how pleasant it would be. He had walked the streets long enough with friends and with girls. He knew what those friends were worth. He knew the girls too. Experience had embittered his heart against the world. Direct characterization, he's bitter against the world. So we have that sense of that all of the laughing and the joviality was a cover for his bitterness. It was artificial. But all hope had not left him. He still had some hope. He felt better after having eaten than he had felt before, after eating, figuratively, a plate of Ireland, less weary of his life, less vanquished in spirit. He might yet be able to settle down in some snug corner and live happily ever. Anyway, I cut it off there, but the ending tells us when he goes and takes the coin that that's probably not going to happen, right? That all of this epiphany comes to naught because of the action at the very end, where he takes the coin and he goes off to, yet again, assume the character of the leech. So, when you're thinking about your narrative, and I know that you should at this point have written it, the first draft, narratives are supposed to be edited. So my request is that you are going to go back through your story and list aspects of characterization on the document and make sure that you're characterizing as richly as you should be. Thank you.